My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm 46 years old, living in the quiet city of Bath, England. For decades, I believed family meant love, loyalty, and safety. But in 2022, at one family dinner, my sister's cruel words ripped away everything I thought I knew about belonging. What happened that night left me broken, humiliated, and determined never to be silent again. If you've ever questioned where you truly belong, listen closely, because my story might feel painfully familiar. The restaurant was warm that evening, golden lights glowing against polished wood tables, laughter echoing from families celebrating birthdays and anniversaries. For me, however, it was not celebration. It was obligation. My sister Emily had insisted we all gather for dinner, a rare family reunion since my parents' passing years ago. I sat at the end of the long table, glancing at the menus, trying to ignore the sharp look Emily shot me the moment I arrived. At 46, I had learned how to wear silence like armor. But tonight, something about her smirk unsettled me. Family, I always stumbled on that word. Because while I carried the Whitmore name, I was not born into it. I was adopted at age 3. My parents never made me feel different. In fact, they had drowned me in love and kindness. But Emily, 5 years younger and my parents' biological daughter, had never stopped reminding me that I didn't truly belong. The waiter approached with a polite smile. "Can I start you with drinks?" Emily leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Yes, but before we order," she said loudly, "Clara, maybe you should think carefully about what you'll eat tonight. It would be a shame if you couldn't pay your share." The table chuckled softly. My cousins exchanged awkward glances. My hands clenched beneath the tablecloth. I cleared my throat. "Emily, it's a family dinner. We're here to spend time together, not..." "Family," she cut in, tilting her glass of wine. "You still think this table is your family? Clara, let's not pretend. You've always been the guest here, the adopted one. Maybe it's time you find another table." Her words struck like a blade. The waiter froze, unsure whether to step back. My stomach churned as heat rose to my face. Guests from nearby tables glanced over, sensing the tension. I whispered, "Why are you doing this?" Emily smiled, a predator sensing blood. "Because someone needs to remind you of your place. And by the way," she pulled a folded piece of paper from her purse and slid it across the table toward me. "This is your share of tonight's bill. $3,270. Consider it the price of pretending." My breath caught. The number blurred before my eyes. Gasps traveled around the table, but no one spoke up. Not one relative defended me. Not one hand reached to take the paper away. At that moment, I felt utterly invisible. I pushed back my chair, the screech loud enough to silence the entire section of the restaurant. Tears threatened, but I refused to let them fall here, not in front of her. "If this is what family looks like to you, Emily, then congratulations. You've succeeded. You've erased me." I left the table, ignoring the stares, ignoring the humiliation crawling up my spine. Out on the street, the night air was cold and sharp, but it tasted like freedom. I walked aimlessly, shoes clacking against wet pavement, each step echoing with a single truth. I was done begging for belonging. What Emily didn't know was that my parents had left me more than just their name. In my mother's final letter, tucked inside an old jewelry box, she had written, "Clara, you were chosen, loved. Never forget, sometimes the strongest families are not the ones you are born into, but the ones you build." As the night wrapped around me, I repeated those words like a prayer. But deep down, another fire sparked, a fire that whispered of justice, of uncovering secrets Emily thought she had buried. Because humiliating me in public was one thing, but taking away my parents' legacy, that was another battle. And I was no longer afraid to fight. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I sat at my small kitchen table, staring at the folded piece of paper Emily had shoved at me. $3,270. The number glared back at me like an accusation, a cruel joke. The humiliation from last night still burned in my chest. I had barely slept, tossing and turning, replaying every smirk on Emily's face, every silent glance from my so-called relatives who had said nothing, absolutely nothing in my defense. My phone buzzed. A message from my cousin Charlotte. "I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't know she'd go that far. Please don't hate us." I stared at the words until they blurred. Apologies were easy after the damage was done. None of them had spoken up when it mattered. None had told Emily to stop. That silence had cut deeper than her words. But beneath the ache, something else stirred, a quiet, steady anger. Emily had spent her life reminding me that I wasn't real family. But I wasn't a helpless little girl anymore. I had lived through grief, through my parents' illness, through the ache of knowing I would never look like anyone in family portraits. I had survived all of that. And now, maybe it was time I stopped surviving quietly. I pulled out the wooden box my mother had left me before she died. Inside, alongside her wedding ring and a bundle of letters, was the key she had pressed into my palm the night she slipped away. "There are things you'll need to know, Clara," she had whispered weakly, "when the time is right." Back then, I hadn't understood. But now, after Emily's attack, I felt the pull of that mystery more than ever. The key belonged to the attic of the old Whitmore estate, our childhood home, which Emily had claimed as her own after my parents passed. She had locked it up, insisting it was too painful to live there. I hadn't set foot inside since the funeral. But if my mother had left me something hidden, something important enough to pass on in secret, then maybe that was the truth Emily had always been afraid of. 2 days later, I drove out to the estate. Rain slicked the country roads, and the house loomed in the distance like a ghost from my past. Its tall windows were dark, its brick walls weathered, ivy climbing like veins. I parked far down the lane, heart pounding. Emily thought she had control over the family legacy, but this key was proof there were still corners she didn't own. The front door was easy enough, an old latch Emily hadn't bothered to fix. The air inside smelled of dust and forgotten memories. My shoes echoed on the wood floors as I climbed the staircase toward the attic door. The key fit perfectly. With a nervous twist, the lock clicked open. Inside, the attic was crowded with boxes, old furniture draped in sheets, and the faint scent of cedar. I pulled the light chain, and a dim bulb flickered to life. There in the far corner sat a chest. On top, taped in my mother's neat handwriting, was a note. "For Clara, when she is ready." My knees went weak. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of documents, photographs, and letters. My breath caught as I pulled one envelope free, addressed in my mother's handwriting, sealed but never mailed. It read, "To the truth of your beginning." I tore it open. "Dearest Clara, you were never a mistake, never a burden. We chose you because you were meant to be ours. What Emily does not know, what no one has ever been told, is that you are the rightful heir to my father's estate. The adoption was not charity, it was legacy. My father's will named you, not Emily, as the inheritor of everything. We kept it quiet to protect you, but if you are reading this, then the time has come for the truth to be known." My hand shook as I held the letter. My heart pounded with a mixture of shock and relief. For years, Emily had thrown the word adopted at me like an insult, a reason to push me out. But the truth meant I was not just family, I was the very foundation of it. I was the heir, not her. The anger that had simmered now flared into something sharper, steadier. Emily had humiliated me, shoved a bill into my hands like I was an outsider begging at her table. But she had no idea that my mother's quiet love had placed me above her in the one way she would never be able to stomach: legacy, power, and inheritance. I closed the chest carefully, tucking the letter and a few supporting documents into my bag. As I left the attic, the storm outside broke into heavy rain. Each drop against the roof sounded like applause, like justice whispering my name. That night, I sat in my apartment and reread my mother's letter again and again. Each word seared into my memory, strengthening my resolve. I wasn't going to run anymore. I wasn't going to be silent. Emily wanted to erase me. Then I would remind her, and everyone else, that I was the daughter my parents had chosen, and the one their legacy had been built upon. The next step was clear. If Emily thought humiliating me in public was the end of the story, she was wrong. This was just the beginning. The restaurant's dim light pressed against me as I stared at the piece of paper in my hand. The numbers looked unreal, like they belonged to someone else's nightmare, $3,270. For a moment I couldn't even breathe. My heart hammered in my chest as if trying to break free. The room around me was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, the chatter of other diners, but at our table there was only silence. Silence and eyes, dozens of eyes. Some avoided me entirely, staring at their plates, pretending to sip their wine. Others watched with thinly veiled amusement, waiting for my reaction. And then there was Melanie, my sister. Her arms folded across her chest, her lips twisted into that cruel, triumphant smile that had haunted me since childhood. "You can handle this, right?" she asked sweetly, tilting her head. The venom behind the words could have poisoned the whole table. I swallowed hard. My hands were trembling, but I clenched them into fists under the table. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Melanie gave a little shrug. "Because you're adopted. You should be grateful we even invite you to these dinners." It was like being stabbed in the chest in front of the entire family. The laughter from other tables blurred into a dull ringing in my ears. My vision swam. I could feel the blood rush to my face, and I knew everyone saw it. Nobody said a word. Not Dad. Not Mom. Not my cousins, who were all staring down at their untouched desserts. My whole life I had tried to prove I belonged, and in one sentence Melanie had ripped that illusion to shreds. My father sat at the end of the table, quiet, his glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. I searched his face for some sign, anger, disappointment, anything, but he only tightened his grip around the glass. He looked at me, then at Melanie, then away. That silence cut me deeper than her insult. Melanie leaned closer, her perfume thick in the air. Her voice dropped so only I could hear. "Pay the bill, earn your place at this table." Something inside me cracked. My chair screeched loudly as I pushed it back and stood. The whole restaurant seemed to turn its head. Forks froze midair, glasses hovered in half-raised hands. My voice shook but carried, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think this is about money? You think humiliating me proves you're better? I've spent my whole life trying to be part of this family, your family, and all you've ever done is push me away." Gasps rippled around the table. Melanie's smirk faltered for the first time, her eyes narrowing as if she hadn't expected me to fight back. My chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. I could feel years of pain rising up, demanding to be heard. Aunt Rose, usually quiet as a shadow, suddenly slammed her palm on the table. "Enough, Melanie," she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. Every head turned to her. "You've treated her like an outsider for too long. Let me remind you, blood doesn't make a family, love does, and you, Melanie, have shown nothing but cruelty." For the first time that night, I felt a flicker of warmth in my chest. Someone saw me. Someone finally said it. But before I could even process that, my father's deep voice cut through the tension. "Stop this," he said, but his tone carried more weight than I'd ever heard. He set his glass down with deliberate calm, then looked directly at me. His eyes were full of something heavy, something I didn't understand. "There's something you need to know about your adoption." The world seemed to freeze, my breath caught, my stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" I asked, though my voice was barely a whisper. He inhaled slowly, the kind of breath you take when you've been holding something in for years. His hands trembled as he finally said it. "You weren't just adopted. You were chosen. Your father, your real father, was my best friend. He gave his life to save mine. Before he died, he made me swear I would raise you as my own. You are family, not by blood, but by honor." The words slammed into me like a tidal wave. For years, I had carried the belief that I was an accident in this house, a burden they tolerated. But in that moment, everything shifted. I wasn't here by chance. I was here because of love, sacrifice, and a promise. Melanie's face twisted with rage. "No," she shouted, her voice cracking. "She doesn't deserve to know that. She doesn't deserve anything." Her fists slammed against the table, rattling the silverware. Tears glistened in her eyes, though whether they came from anger or pain, I couldn't tell. "She's taken everything from me, Dad's attention, Mom's affection, even the family's respect." I stared at her, stunned. For the first time, I realized her cruelty wasn't just about me. It was about her own fear, her jealousy, her desperation to be seen. "You always had everything, Melanie," I said, my voice steady now clear. "The name, the bloodline, the acceptance. I had to fight for every ounce of love I got in this family. Every insult, every whisper, every reminder that I didn't belong, I carried it alone. And still I stayed. Still I loved you all." My father stood then, tall and unshakable, his presence filling the room. "That's enough, Melanie. If anyone owes this family, it's you, for the bitterness and hatred you've poured into it. She has done nothing but prove herself again and again." The weight of his words crushed her. She sank into her chair, her face pale, lips trembling, her eyes burning with silent fury. The bill was still lying there on the table, mocking me. $3,270. I reached into my bag, pulled out my card, and laid it on top. The waiter stepped forward hesitantly, glancing at the tense scene, but I gave him a nod. Gasps rose around the table again. "Why?" Aunt Rose whispered softly. "Because I'm not paying to prove myself," I answered. My voice was calm now, stronger than I thought it could be. "I'm paying to prove something else. That strength isn't about tearing people down. It's about rising above them." I gathered my coat and walked away from the table, my heels clicking against the floor. My pulse was still racing, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was freedom. For the first time, I felt like I had taken control of the story. But just as I reached the door, her voice followed me, sharp and trembling, filled with venom she couldn't swallow. "You think this is over?" Melanie hissed. "You have no idea what I've planned next." I froze, my hand on the door. The words echoed through me, colder than the autumn wind outside. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see her face, red, twisted, eyes blazing with hatred. Her warning wasn't empty. I could feel it. Something darker was coming. Something that would shatter more than just a family dinner. And in that moment, I knew the fight had only just begun. I didn't sleep that night. My mind replayed the scene from the restaurant again and again, the smug curve of Melanie's lips. The way she pushed that bill across the table like I was some stranger who had wandered into their family dinner. Even when I closed my eyes, I could still see the numbers. $3,270. The humiliation wasn't about the money, it was about the message. Melanie was declaring to the entire family and to the world that I didn't belong, that I was the outsider, the adopted sister. But as I stared at the ceiling in the dim glow of my bedroom lamp, one thought consumed me. Why now? Why was my adoption suddenly being used as a weapon? And why did my father, quiet, trembling, let that truth slip after decades of silence? I decided I couldn't just sit in that confusion anymore. I needed answers. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. Their cottage in the countryside had always been my place of safety growing up. The ivy climbing its stone walls, the rose bushes my mother tended in spring. It was supposed to be my sanctuary. But as I stepped inside, the air felt heavy. My father, Richard, sat in his old leather armchair. He looked 10 years older than the man who had sat at that dinner table the night before. "Dad," I said, my voice breaking, "we need to talk." He nodded, gesturing to the sofa. My mother, Anne, lingered in the kitchen doorway, her hands wringing the edge of her apron. Why did you never tell me?" My voice cracked. "All these years I thought." "You are our daughter," Richard cut in sharply, his blue eyes fierce despite the exhaustion on his face. "Blood doesn't make a family, Clara. Love does. We didn't tell you because it never mattered to us." "Then why does it matter to Melanie?" I demanded. "Why did she throw it in my face like I'm nothing?" Anne's eyes filled with tears. "Because she's jealous," she whispered. "You've always had something she couldn't stand, resilience. You never let life defeat you, Clara. Melanie, for all her privilege, has always been fragile, and fragile people, they lash out." I swallowed hard. So she used my adoption to break me. Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "But she doesn't know everything." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked at Anne, then back at me. "The truth about your birth family, the reason you were adopted, it's complicated and painful." My chest tightened. For 46 years, I had lived without those details. Now, suddenly, they dangled in front of me like keys to a locked room. "I want to know," I whispered. "All of it." Richard exhaled, his hands trembling. "Your biological father was a man named Edward Hale. Wealthy, powerful, but ruthless. He abandoned your mother the moment he found out she was pregnant. She couldn't raise you alone. That's how you came to us." The name struck me like lightning. Edward Hale. It echoed in my memory, familiar yet distant. "Wait," I said slowly. "Hale, as in Hale Industries." Richard's silence was confirmation. Shock coursed through me. Hale Industries was one of the largest real estate empires in the UK. Billion-dollar company. Headlines in every paper. And if what Richard said was true, then the man at the top of that empire was my biological father. The room swayed. Melanie had always taunted me for being adopted, for being less. But the irony was unbearable. My bloodline carried more power and money than she could ever imagine. "Does she know?" I asked quietly. Anne shook her head. "No, we wanted to protect you. Edward Hale wanted nothing to do with you. To him, you didn't exist." Anger burned in my chest. Well, I exist, and it's time he knows it. For the next week, I carried that name, Edward Hale, like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. Every humiliation Melanie had thrown at me, every cutting word, every sly smirk, they all fused into a single purpose. I started digging. I searched through archives, online reports, and corporate records. Edward Hale had built his empire with charm and cruelty in equal measure. He was praised as a visionary, feared as a tyrant. And now, in his late 70s, he still sat at the helm of his empire, untouchable. But I wasn't after his money. I wanted my identity. I wanted to stand in front of him and force him to acknowledge me, not as a secret, not as an inconvenience, but as his daughter. And deep down, a darker thought whispered, exposing this truth could shatter Melanie. She thrived on hierarchy, on being the real daughter. Imagine her face when she learned the sister she mocked had ties to one of the wealthiest families in England. One night, as rain tapped against my window, I wrote in my journal. All my life, I wanted acceptance. Maybe it's time I stop begging for it. Maybe it's time I show them who I really am. I made my move. Through a journalist contact, I arranged a meeting at a private club in London where Edward Hale often dined. I wore a simple black dress, not flashy, but commanding. My heart pounded as I approached his table. He looked older than the photos. Silver hair, sharp suit, eyes like steel. "Mr. Hale," I said softly. He looked up mildly annoyed. "Yes." "My name is Clara Whitmore." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "And I believe I'm your daughter." The fork slipped from his hand, clattering against the china. For a moment, the titan of industry looked small, shaken. "Who told you this?" His voice was hoarse. "My father," I said firmly. "The man who raised me, the man who never let me feel unwanted until my sister tried to break me with the truth." His face went pale. He glanced around, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "This conversation cannot happen here," he muttered. "Tomorrow, my office, 10 a.m. I left the club with my pulse racing. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange kind of power thrumming in my veins. Back home, I stood before the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the broken, humiliated figure from that dinner table. She was someone new. I whispered to my reflection, Melanie wanted me to feel like I didn't belong, but she has no idea. I belong somewhere she could never reach. But as I lay in bed, one fear lingered. What if Edward Hale rejected me again, just like he did decades ago? What if I was walking into another storm, another humiliation? I closed my eyes, steadying my breath. No matter what happened tomorrow, I would walk into his office not as an outcast, but as Clara Whitmore, the woman who survived abandonment, betrayal, and cruelty. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter of my life would belong to me. Night was heavy with silence, and Emma stood by the window staring into the deserted street outside. Sleep had abandoned her long ago. Her mind was restless, chasing shadows of memories and unanswered questions. The wind stirred the curtains softly, but her heart felt like it carried the weight of an entire storm. She thought of Jason, his smile, his words, his promises, and the bitterness that now stained every memory of him. He had once been her anchor, but now he was the storm that threatened to drown her. Yet Emma knew deep inside that the battle was no longer only about betrayal or heartbreak. This was not just revenge. This was survival, dignity, and truth. The next morning, as she wandered through her father's old study, she stumbled upon a dusty file tucked away in the back of a wooden cabinet. Curiosity stirred, and she pulled it out, her fingers trembling as if her body already sensed what her mind was about to discover. Inside were old land deeds, business agreements, and letters, documents that tied Jason and Richard together in ways Emma had never imagined. She flipped through the papers, and with every page her heart sank deeper. There it was, proof that Jason had never entered her life by accident. From the very beginning, her marriage had been part of a plan, a calculated move to gain control over her father's fortune and her family's business. Emma's breath caught when she discovered a letter signed by Jason himself, written to an unknown accomplice. The words cut through her like knives. "Once everything belongs to us, Emma will have no choice but to bend to our will. She will be powerless just as we intended." Her hands shook violently, her eyes stung with tears, but this time the tears were not born from pain alone. They burned with fury. Emma realized that love had been a mask, a performance carefully orchestrated to blind her. Every memory, every moment she once cherished, suddenly felt poisoned. But the more her heart bled, the stronger her resolve grew. She would not remain their victim. If they had scripted her downfall, she would rewrite the ending. She dialed Rachel's number, her voice steady though her soul trembled. "Rachel, it's time," Emma said. "I have enough evidence now. I can't stay silent any longer." Rachel hesitated. Emma could hear her sigh across the line. "Emma, you don't understand what you're stepping into. Jason and Richard, they're powerful. They have influence, connections, money. They will destroy you before you even get close." Emma's gaze hardened as she clutched the letter in her hand. "Rachel, if I turn back now, I'll lose more than my name. I'll lose myself. You know the truth as well as I do. It's time to expose them." There was a pause, and then Rachel's voice softened with reluctant strength. "If this is the path you choose, I'll stand with you. But understand, this will be the final fight." From that moment on, Emma's plan began to take shape. A storm was coming, and she would not face it unprepared. She discovered that an upcoming business conference in the city was scheduled for the following week, a gathering of investors, leaders, and media. Jason and Richard were set to announce their grand expansion project there, the one that would cement their empire. Emma knew this was her opportunity. If the truth was revealed on such a stage, there would be no hiding from it. For days, Emma worked in silence, gathering every piece of evidence she had uncovered. She scanned documents, copied agreements, and even sent anonymous packages to media outlets. Bank transfers, fraudulent deals, hidden partnerships. It was all there, a web of corruption spun carefully by Jason and Richard. By the time she was done, she held in her hands the power to tear down everything they had built on lies. The day of the conference arrived. The grand hall glittered with chandeliers, the air buzzing with anticipation. Men in suits and women in elegant gowns filled the seats, murmuring with excitement about the announcement. Cameras were set, microphones adjusted, and reporters scribbled in their notebooks. Jason walked to the stage, his face radiating confidence. He spoke with the charm that once had enchanted Emma, while Richard sat beside him with a smile of smug satisfaction. To the crowd, they looked untouchable, victorious. But Emma was there too, hidden among the audience, her heart racing as she waited. She felt the weight of every second as Jason began his speech, painting a grand picture of the future, of prosperity, of success. And then, it happened. The giant screen behind him flickered, and suddenly, instead of the company logo, documents appeared. Contracts, letters, evidence of fraud and deceit, all magnified for the entire hall to see. The audience gasped. Murmurs filled the air, turning into shocked whispers. Reporters leaned forward, cameras zoomed in. Jason froze mid-sentence, his expression cracking. Richard leapt from his seat, trying to block the screen, his voice raised in panic. But it was too late. Every eye in the room had seen the truth. Every camera had captured it. Emma sat in the back, her hands clenched tightly together, her chest heaving as relief and adrenaline surged through her. For the first time in a long time, she felt the scales begin to balance. She had struck back, not with violence or rage, but with truth. But the victory was short-lived. Later that night, Richard cornered her outside the venue. His voice dripped with venom as he hissed, "Do you think this is over, Emma? You've humiliated us, but you've started a war you can't win. We will ruin you. You'll regret ever crossing us." Emma met his glare with steady eyes. "You can threaten me, Richard, but the truth is no longer yours to bury. The world has seen what you are, and no matter what you do, you'll never erase it." Richard's lips twisted into a sinister smile before he disappeared into the night. The chill he left behind clung to Emma's skin, but she refused to let fear take root. She had crossed the line of no return, and there was no going back. The days that followed were chaotic. Jason and Richard scrambled to control the damage. They filed lawsuits, spread rumors, and tried to paint Emma as unstable, as a bitter woman seeking revenge. But the evidence was undeniable, and public opinion began to shift. More victims came forward, employees they had exploited, partners they had cheated, families they had destroyed. Emma was no longer alone. She had become a voice for the silenced. Yet the danger grew. One night, shots rang out near her home. The sound of bullets slicing through the dark sent her heart racing, but she refused to run. She reported it, knowing well that it was a warning. Jason and Richard would not stop at slander. They were ready to destroy her by any means necessary. Rachel, terrified for her friend's life, begged her to stop. "Emma, please, they'll kill you. You've done enough. You've proven your point." But Emma only shook her head, her eyes burning with determination. "No, Rachel, if I stop now, they win. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone they've hurt, everyone they will continue to hurt if no one stands against them. I can't walk away." Emma was no longer the fragile, heartbroken woman she once was. The betrayal had forged her into steel. Every word she spoke carried weight, every move was calculated. She built a small team around her, young lawyers eager to fight injustice, journalists hungry for the truth, and people who had been crushed by Jason and Richard's greed. Together, they formed a movement, not just to bring Jason down, but to create a wave that could no longer be silenced. But Jason was a man cornered, and a cornered man is the most dangerous of all. His empire was crumbling, his reputation shredded, and his pride bleeding. The smile that once charmed boardrooms now twisted with rage. Richard whispered in his ear, fueling the fire, pushing him toward darker paths. They had money still, and with money came men willing to do anything. Emma could feel the shadows closing in, the air growing heavier as the final confrontation drew near. Every step she took felt like it could be her last, but fear no longer dictated her choices. Her resolve was stronger than her fear. She would see this through, no matter the cost. And so, in the shadows of the end, Emma prepared herself for the final act. The war had begun with lies and betrayal, but it would end with truth and fire. She knew the path ahead would demand everything from her courage, her strength, perhaps even her life. But she whispered to herself as she stood once more by the window, staring into the restless night. "No matter what happens, they will never break me again." The stage was set, the curtain had risen, and the world would soon witness the final reckoning. The night of truth arrived like a storm that no one could escape. The tension in the family was no longer an invisible thread. It was a rope pulling each of us in opposite directions until something had to snap. The restaurant dinner, the cruel words, and the bills slammed in front of me had torn away every last illusion I carried about belonging. Yet, standing at the doorway of the house I once called home, I realized that tonight would not just be another argument. Tonight would be the night everything was exposed, and nothing could be hidden anymore. I walked in with heavy steps, my heart thundering inside my chest. The air inside the living room was thick, almost suffocating, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. My sister sat casually on the couch, her phone glowing in her hands, pretending as if nothing mattered. My parents were already waiting, their faces tense, caught between the desire to control the chaos and the fear of what might unravel. The moment I entered, her eyes flicked up from her screen, and a smirk touched her lips. "Oh, look who finally decided to come home," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "I thought maybe you'd run away since you couldn't pay your share last time." The words stung sharper than glass, but I didn't flinch. I had promised myself no more silence. I stood tall, my voice firm but calm. That dinner wasn't about food or bills. It was about humiliation. You wanted to remind me once again that I'm adopted, that no matter what I do, I'll never be your real sibling. The room fell quiet. My mother's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. My father shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between us like he was watching a battlefield he couldn't control. My sister laughed, the sound bitter and cold. "Finally, you admit it. You don't belong here. You never did. And don't twist it into some sob story. You've always been the outsider, always trying too hard to fit in, always waiting for someone to hand you a place at the table." Her words echoed through the room, louder than they should have, carving wounds I thought had healed long ago. But this time, instead of breaking me, they fueled something deep inside, a fire that had been waiting to rise. "I don't need you to hand me a place at the table," I replied, my voice trembling with strength rather than weakness. "I've earned my place with every sacrifice, every moment I gave to this family, every time I put you before myself. You see me as an outsider. Fine, but I've been more of a family to you than you have ever been to me." For the first time, her smirk faltered. My father cleared his throat, but I raised a hand, stopping him. "No, tonight this needs to be said. No more silence, no more pretending." My mother's eyes glistened with tears, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this. We're family." The words hit me harder than my sister's cruelty. Family. That word had been my anchor for years, the reason I endured, the reason I stayed. But what kind of family makes you feel like a stranger in your own home? What kind of family throws you aside because of blood you didn't choose? I took a deep breath, my chest tight, and stepped closer to them. Do you know what it feels like to walk into every room and feel like you don't belong? To sit at every dinner table knowing someone is waiting to remind you you're different? Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep wishing I could change who I am, just to be accepted by the people I love most? Silence. No one spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking on the wall, each second stretching like an eternity. I turned to my sister. "You think you've won because you managed to make me feel small. But tonight, I take back everything you tried to steal, my dignity, my worth, my place in this world. I won't let your cruelty define me anymore." Her eyes narrowed, anger flaring as she shot back. "Don't act like a martyr. You're just bitter because the truth hurts. You were adopted because no one else wanted you. We gave you a life, and you should be grateful instead of playing the victim." The words sliced through the air like knives. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and my father finally snapped, his voice booming. "Enough." But I didn't need him to defend me. I steadied myself, my voice stronger than ever. "Grateful? You think adoption is something to hold over my head? You think love is a debt I'll never repay? If you gave me a life, it was not a gift to throw in my face whenever you felt like breaking me. And if gratitude means swallowing abuse, then maybe I've been grateful for far too long." The energy in the room shifted. My sister's confidence cracked, her lips tightening as she tried to hold on to her power. My parents looked shaken, trapped between guilt and shame. I moved closer, my voice low but sharp. "You made me feel like a shadow in my own home. But let me tell you something, you don't get to decide my worth. You don't get to decide whether I belong. I belong because I choose to stand here, because I choose to love, even when it's not returned. And if that's not enough for you, then maybe this house was never home to begin with." For the first time, my sister had no response. Her phone slipped from her hand onto the couch, her eyes darting nervously as though she was searching for words that refused to come. I turned to my parents, the pain in my voice undeniable. "You let this happen. You stood by while she tore me down again and again. You told me to ignore it, to be patient, to keep the peace. But silence only fed her cruelty. I needed you to stand with me, and you never did." Tears spilled down my mother's cheeks. My father lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. The truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable and sharp. "I am done being silent," I said, my voice steady. "Tonight, I reclaim myself. Whether you stand with me or against me, I will no longer bow to shame. I will no longer eat at a table where my existence is treated as a mistake. The room felt like it was on fire, the weight of years of hidden wounds finally erupting. I could see it in their faces, the shock, the guilt, the realization that nothing would ever be the same after this night. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. The wedding hall shimmered under a canopy of chandeliers, golden light pouring down on polished marble floors. I had walked into this world like a ghost returning from exile, my heart a trembling prisoner inside my chest. People didn't notice me at first. They were too busy laughing, sipping champagne, and adjusting glittering dresses. But as I stepped deeper into the hall, heels echoing like quiet thunder, heads began to turn. Some eyes flickered with confusion, others with recognition. But the one pair of eyes I had been waiting for, the eyes of my husband, Edward, finally found me. The glass in his hand slipped. It didn't shatter, but the sound of it hitting the table was loud enough to silence laughter around him. His fingers trembled. For a man who had always been carved out of stone, that shake was louder than any scream. Margaret, his lips barely shaped my name. 5 years had passed since I had last heard it from him. 5 years since I had been erased from my daughter's life, cast out like I had never existed. I could feel every gaze in the hall press against me, but I kept my chin high. I was invited, I said softly, my voice carrying farther than I expected. This is my daughter's wedding, and I am her mother. Gasps whispered through the guests. My daughter, Isabella, stood frozen at the front, her hand clutching the bouquet like it was her last anchor. Her veil trembled as she turned, and for the first time in 5 years our eyes met. Her lips parted, but no words came. And in that moment, the flood of memory hit me. The night they locked me out of my own home, the day Edward signed the papers to erase me from everything, the months I spent wondering if my child would even remember the sound of my voice. Edward moved first. His expensive shoes clicked against the floor as he approached, every step filled with hesitation. He had once been a man of absolute control, but right now, his face was pale, his hands still shaking. "What are you doing here?" His voice was a broken whisper meant only for me, but the whole room seemed to lean closer to listen. "I told you," I answered firmly. "I came for my daughter, nothing more." He swallowed hard. His jaw clenched as though he wanted to argue, but the fire in my eyes stopped him. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly. Guests shifted uncomfortably. The wedding was hanging in suspension, like a breath caught in the air. Finally, Isabella dropped her bouquet. The sound of flowers hitting the ground was louder than any thunder. She ran toward me, her gown swishing behind her, and stopped just a foot away. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice cracked, breaking through the years of silence that had kept us apart. Tears brimmed in her eyes, and for the first time since that cruel night, I saw not the girl who had been turned against me, but the child I had once rocked to sleep. "Yes," I said, my own voice trembling. "It's me, darling." Her hands reached for mine, and when our fingers touched, the room seemed to vanish. No chandeliers, no whispers, no judgmental eyes, just me and the little girl I thought I had lost forever. But before she could embrace me fully, Edward's voice cut through. "Isabella," he warned, his tone sharp but unsteady, "this is not the time." She froze, torn between us. And in that split second, I realized this wedding wasn't just about vows, it was about truth, about everything that had been stolen from me and the lies that had been fed to my daughter. I turned to Edward, my voice steady. "You told her I abandoned her. You told the world I was gone because I wanted to be, but the truth is, I was forced out." The crowd gasped again, a ripple of shock tearing through the room. Edward's face hardened. "This is not the place." "It is exactly the place," I interrupted. My voice echoed against the marble walls. "Because this is the day my daughter begins her new life, and she deserves to know the truth about the family she comes from." Edward's composure shattered. He grabbed the edge of the table for support, his knuckles white. "Margaret, please," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Don't do this here." But it was too late. Isabella's eyes darted between us, confusion and hurt clouding her face. "What truth?" she demanded, her voice rising for the first time. Dad, what is she talking about? Edward didn't answer. His silence was enough. The hall buzzed with whispers now, the weight of scandal heavy in the air. Guests leaned in, desperate to catch every word. The groom's family looked horrified, but I stood tall. For 5 years, I had carried this silence like a stone in my chest. Tonight, I was setting it down. Isabella, I said gently, turning back to her, the night they locked me out of our home, I stood at the door begging to be let in. But your father had already decided I no longer belonged. I didn't leave you. I never chose to walk away. I was forced to. Her lips quivered. Her hands shook as tears streamed down her cheeks. Is that true? She whispered, looking at Edward. Did you really? Edward's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He lowered his gaze, shame painting his face in a way I had never seen before. Yes, I answered for him. My own tears finally fell, but my voice was clear. It's true, and I have carried that pain every single day, but I came here tonight not to ruin your wedding. I came because I could not let this day pass without looking into your eyes again. Isabella broke. She threw herself into my arms, sobbing against my shoulder, her veil brushing my cheek. I held her tight, my own sobs finally escaping. And in that embrace, I felt it, the power of walking away, the strength of surviving what was meant to destroy me. The guests were still buzzing when a sudden sound cut through the moment. A voice from the groom's side rose sharply. Wait a second, a man said, stepping forward, his face pale. He held up a folder in his hand, trembling. Before this wedding continues, there's something I need to say, something that involves the bride and her father. The entire hall fell into stunned silence again. Edward's face drained of all color. His hands began to shake violently this time, and I knew, whatever was about to be revealed, it would change everything. The man's voice cut through the silence of the wedding hall like a blade. Every guest turned toward him, curiosity and unease rippling through the room. He was young, perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a sharp suit that didn't quite hide the tremble in his hands. He held the folder close, as though it carried the weight of something that could crush him. Edward's face drained of all color. His lips parted, but no sound came. Isabella, still clinging to me, looked from her father to the stranger with wide, tear-filled eyes. What's going on? She whispered, her voice breaking. The man cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on Isabella. My name is Daniel, he said softly. I didn't come here to cause trouble, but what I discovered, what I can't keep hidden, it affects you, Isabella, and you deserve to know before you take another step tonight. The guests leaned forward, whispers stirring like leaves in a storm. I tightened my hold on my daughter's hand, my heart racing. For years, I had carried my own truth, but I could see in Edward's trembling posture that this revelation was not mine. It was his, and it was darker than I could have imagined. Edward finally found his voice, though it shook like brittle glass. Stop this. You have no right to speak here. Daniel shook his head, his grip on the folder tightening. Maybe not, but when I found these documents, when I realized what they meant, I couldn't stay silent. He turned to Isabella, his voice gentler now. Your entire life you've been told a story about your family, but the truth, he paused, breath quivering, the truth has been hidden. Isabella's face crumpled with fear and confusion. What truth? Someone please tell me what is happening. Daniel opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. He held up the top one for the hall to see. This is a financial record. Payments made from Edward Blake to a woman over 2 decades. Large sums every year. At first glance, it might look like charity or business, but the details say otherwise. Gasps echoed through the hall. Edward stumbled forward, trying to snatch the papers, but Daniel stepped back quickly, his voice rising. It wasn't charity, it wasn't business. It was silence money, paid to keep the truth buried. My heart pounded as the words settled over the stunned crowd. Silence money. The phrase alone was enough to chill every bone in the room. Isabella turned to her father, her eyes desperate. What is he talking about? Dad, tell me this isn't true. Edward shook his head violently, but his silence betrayed him. His trembling lips, the way his shoulders sagged, it was all there. Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength. That woman, her name is Lydia Moore. She wasn't a stranger. She wasn't just anyone. She was, he swallowed hard, looking at Isabella with pity. She was your biological mother. The hall erupted in chaos. Gasps, shouts, murmurs filled the air. I felt the world tilt beneath me, the revelation slamming into my chest like a hammer. My knees threatened to give way, but I held on for Isabella's sake. No, Isabella shook her head, backing away from everyone. No, that can't be true. Mom is right here. She pointed at me desperately, tears spilling down her cheeks. This is my mom. This is the woman who raised me. Tell him, Mom, tell him. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but steady. You are my daughter, Isabella. That will never change. But I turned to Edward, my eyes burning into him. You tell her the truth. You tell her what you've done. Edward collapsed into a chair, his hands covering his face. For the first time in his life, the powerful businessman looked like nothing more than a broken man. His voice came out muffled. It's true. The words dropped like stones. Edward lifted his head, eyes bloodshot, shame dripping from every line of his face. She was someone I loved before Margaret. But when I learned she was pregnant, I panicked. I was building my career, my name. A child out of wedlock would have ruined everything. So I paid her to disappear. I thought it was the only way. The crowd hissed with disgust. I felt bile rise in my throat. Edward's voice cracked as he continued. When she had Isabella, she gave her to me. And Margaret was the one who raised her, who gave her everything. But I never told the truth. I buried it with money and lies. And when Margaret discovered it, when she tried to confront me, his voice broke, I erased her instead. It was easier to paint her as the villain than to face what I had done. The room exploded in noise. Some guests shouted, others covered their mouths in shock. Isabella stood frozen, her face pale, tears flooding down her cheeks. She turned to me, her body trembling. You knew. I shook my head quickly, my heart breaking at the devastation in her eyes. No, Isabella, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know the full truth. I only knew your father was hiding something, and when I tried to expose it, he silenced me. But hear me, darling, I chose you. From the moment I held you, you were mine. Blood doesn't change that. Love doesn't change that. Isabella collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. I held her tight, my own tears streaming. But the nightmare wasn't over. Daniel stepped forward again, his tone sharper now. There's more. Lydia Moore, your biological mother, she's still alive. The hall froze. Edward's head jerked up, horror flashing in his eyes. No, that's not possible. Daniel laid the final document on the table. She lives 3 towns over. She never died, as you told everyone. She's been there all these years, waiting for her daughter to know the truth. The guests gasped again, their whispers now fevered and sharp. Isabella's sobs quieted. She pulled away from me, her face wet with tears, her voice trembling. She's alive. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, and she deserves to be heard too. The weight of the revelation pressed down on the hall like a storm about to break. Edward slumped in his chair, defeated, destroyed. Isabella looked between me, her father, and the man with the folder, her heart visibly breaking. And in that moment, I realized this wedding wasn't going to be remembered for love or vows. It would be remembered for truth. Truth that had been buried for decades, clawing its way back to the surface at the worst possible moment. The chandeliers above flickered, as though the room itself trembled under the weight of it all. And as Isabella's hand slipped from mine, I knew the next step she would take, whether toward me, her father, or the ghost of a mother she had never known, would decide everything. By the time weeks had rolled into months, the small city that once felt like a cage had become a place of renewal for me. I had planted seeds of my own independence there, finding a modest rhythm that allowed me to breathe without fear of judgment. Yet even as I built this quiet life, echoes of that fateful dinner with my sister never fully faded. The bitterness of her words, the sting of that bill slammed into my lap, still throbbed like a bruise I couldn't completely ignore. It was on one such evening, while I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of old journals, that the phone buzzed again. My hand hovered over it as though it might burn me. When I finally looked down, the name flashing across the screen froze my breath in my throat. Clara, my sister. For a moment, I nearly let it ring out. The memories of her cold smirk, her dismissal, and the way she treated me like an outsider flooded back, screaming at me to protect the fragile peace I had managed to build. But something deeper, maybe the part of me that still wanted answers, made me press accept. Her voice trembled through the line, not with the arrogance I remembered, but with a vulnerability I had never heard. "Evelyn," she whispered, my name sounding almost unfamiliar on her lips. "I need to see you." The silence between us stretched, heavy and dangerous. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, and in that sound was a truth I hadn't expected. She was broken in some way I couldn't yet see. Against the instinct to cut her off completely, I agreed to meet. When I arrived at the cafe, she looked nothing like the glamorous, confident sister who had once commanded every room. Her eyes were sunken, her clothes wrinkled, and her hands twisted together nervously on the table. For the first time, she looked smaller than me, almost fragile. "I'm sick," she said finally, her voice shaking. "The doctors don't know how long I have, and I don't want to leave things like this." The words hit me like a crashing wave. Anger, grief, compassion, and disbelief tangled inside me. A part of me wanted to scream, wanted to demand why it had taken facing death for her to see me as worthy of a conversation. Another part of me wanted to run from the table and never look back. But the deepest part, the one that still carried the ache of being abandoned, simply sat in stunned silence. Clara reached across the table, her hand trembling as it inched closer. "I was cruel," she admitted. "I wanted to feel powerful, to make you small, but I see now it was me who was small all along. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to hear me say it." Her words cracked something open in me. I had replayed that dinner countless times in my head, imagining what I would say if I ever had the chance. But in this moment, staring at a woman who had been my tormentor and my sister all in one, I realized nothing I rehearsed would matter. What mattered was choice, my choice. I chose to speak with honesty, not vengeance. "Clara, you destroyed me that night. You took the one place I thought I belonged and made it a battlefield. I left because I had no other way to survive. But I built something for myself since then. And now, sitting here, I realize I don't need your approval anymore." Tears filled her eyes, and for once she had no defense, no sharp retort. She simply nodded, as though each word was a sentence she deserved to carry. In the weeks that followed, we met a few more times. I didn't forgive her fully, not in the neat way people imagine forgiveness works. But I gave her presence. I let her sit in her regret, and I gave myself the dignity of being heard. When the end came for her, it wasn't with a triumphant reconciliation, nor with a cold silence. It was with a quiet, complicated goodbye, one that honored both my pain and her humanity. And when I walked away from her hospital room that final time, I understood something that had eluded me for years. Strength wasn't in winning the argument or forcing someone to admit they were wrong. Strength was in choosing not to let their cruelty define you forever. I stepped back into my own life, my own home, with a certainty I had never felt before. The chapter with Clara was over, but my story was not. I had survived being erased, belittled, and discarded. I had survived the weight of silence and the temptation of bitterness. And in surviving, I had built something unshakable, the unrelenting power of knowing my worth. So when I sit at my table now, when I pour tea into my favorite chipped mug and let the steam rise into the air, I no longer ache for a seat at anyone else's table. I am my own table, my own story, my own ending. And that is more powerful than any apology, any reconciliation, or any validation I could have begged for. Because the truth I discovered, painfully and beautifully, is this: walking away is not weakness. It is the ultimate strength. And sometimes, the life you create after walking away is the greatest revenge of all.